What is the most WTF thing that happened with your neighbor? Our neighbor provides so much entertainment for us. We've set up a bar overlooking the front of our houses, which we've called Shenanigans, since that's what we get to watch from our bar stools. He's an on-off user who finds it impossible to live alone, so invites a series of other dealers to live with him. They stay for a few months until there's a huge fight or a series of them, and they move out again. In the 3 years we've lived here, we've had the police turn up most weeks, we've had several people coded, and we've had multiple people using substances while sitting in their cars in our driveway. There have been 2 kids living there for a few months each, and I have had to contact child protection about both of them. They both moved out now, and I think about them constantly, hoping they're doing okay. Both absolutely adorable kids, and hearing the treatment one received from his mother makes me cry every time I think about it. The other one was talking about ending it all at 8 years old. My heart is broken knowing I can't help them any further. The thing is, our neighbor is lovely. He's just very lost and broken, and we have tried so hard to be supportive to him, particularly when he's going through another breakup or a relapse. He means well. I got head lice from hugging him for a long time once, but he was just so sad and having horrible withdrawals. I called the police one time for a welfare check because he had just discharged himself, against advice, from hospital following a code, and when I saw him the next day, he was a mess. I was so scared he'd code again, so I called the police to come with the crisis team. They did, and I was so worried I destroyed our good relationship, but the police came over afterwards and said he had actually thanked them for coming. He wanted me to know he appreciated that someone was looking out for him. I hope so much that he comes through all of this and finds the help he needs, but he's showing signs of having relapsed again right now, so I'm not sure it'll be anytime soon. Well, that's one way to keep the neighborhood watch entertained, right? Story 2. New next-door neighbors moved in, older couple. He would watch me work out outside in the summer, just standing by his fence in his backyard and staring at me in sports garments and shorts until I was done. I started exercising inside after that. We have a big family, lots of young kids that come over. He would watch them from his backyard. And one day we noticed a camera. No big deal, we live in a rural area and my family has security cameras too. He pointed to our side and backyard. All his cameras faced our yard, not his or any of his property. We eventually figured out how much he could see with those cameras, like into our living room through the glass doors and such. Weird. But then we realized how weird it was to have cameras pointing at little kids. We asked him to move them, went up to his door and saw a computer with all the footage on it. Anyway, he was a registered offender from the next town over. He either had to move or be registered and put on the list. He moved. He was watching us constantly. I swear he was when I was working out, but had no proof. Our family eventually argued with him, and I got a call one night that my twin had jumped his fence and half my family had too to roughen him and his family. They moved. Story 3. Hired her 19 to 20-year-old daughter to babysit while I was at work for one day only. Daughter shows up holding a small Yorkie puppy and says, "I hope you don't mind, I brought my dog." Weird, she would do this anyway because she knew I had 2 giant dogs. They play rough. She saw the puppy down and my dogs immediately wanted to play and scared it so it whelped. She acted like there was a crime. Little did I know this puppy was not potty trained as well. I sat out lunch for my kids, 5 and 6 years old. Easy instant ramen and PBJ. She didn't reply to my texts all day, so I came home on my lunch break to check in. She was sleeping on the couch. There was dog mess everywhere. My dogs were locked in a bedroom, and my kids were surrounded in junk food wrappers as she hadn't fed them. I said hello, and she sat up and said, "Oh, man, I was just trying too hard to stay awake." I told her thank you for her time, but I was able to leave work early. I texted her and said, "Why would you randomly bring your puppy to my house and allow it to mess all over, and then not bother to clean it up? Why would you not be able to stay awake for a short period of time or make sure that my children were fed?" She responded by accusing me of stealing her mom's dog, my next-door neighbor. And then my neighbor texted me and said not to ever speak to her daughter that way again and called me a dog stealer, etc. And then the neighbor called the gas company and reported a fake leak and they shut off my gas to check everything out. I told her to stop and said I was just worried you were going to cause an accident. What the heck? Things progressively got more ridiculous. Thankfully, we moved and put it all behind us. Story 4. A long while ago, the woman a few houses down from us passed out in the alley by her garage. It was late at night and she was known to be a heavy drinker. The guy who lived next door to her came driving through the alley not long after she passed out and, well, he was hammered as well and hit her thinking she was a trash bag left outside. She didn't survive. He decided to park in his own garage and run inside like nothing happened. My stepmom came home from her shift at the hospital soon after all this. SM saw the woman in the alley and got out to check on her. Then the guy comes out of his house freaking out, asking what happened and claiming SM ended this woman. Obviously, SM ignores him and calls the police. Dude still tries to convince the police that SM ran the woman over. It would have gone on much longer if the neighbors across the alley didn't have security cameras. The whole incident was recorded and the guy was quickly carted off to court. Apologies, I don't remember how or what he was charged with. This was a very long time ago. So crazy, man, and thanks, security cams. Story 5. I just moved in and worked a job which ended at midnight, got to bed, and about an hour later saw flashing lights coming from the house next door. Neighbor owned a Corvette and it was on the lawn with police cars all around it. Neighbor was a cop. I assumed that someone tried to steal it and went back to bed. Next day, a neighbor from the other side of my house asked me if I knew what happened. I told him I assumed someone tried to steal his car and they must have caught them. He told me, no, his girlfriend ended it all. The next day, the neighbor's white couch was on the front lawn with a big stain on it. It stayed there for a couple of days and the neighbor moved out shortly after. A couple of years passed and we got a call from the state investigator's office. He asked me if I knew the neighbor well and said that I didn't get a chance to get to know him since he moved out shortly after his girlfriend ended it all. The investigator said, she didn't end it all. Story 6. One of my dad's neighbors for many years was an old woman whose adult son lived in the same home, but they had basically split the house in half. He had his own door to go in and out and everything. They weren't close, and it wasn't weird if she didn't see or hear him for days at a time. Well, one summer, during a record heat wave, the AC was out, and a terrible smell started coming from his end of the house. She was terrified, for the exact reason you probably assume, and after calling the police to do a wellness check so that she didn't have to look at herself, it was confirmed correct. They took it, but told her cleanup was a private matter. She couldn't move the mattress herself and couldn't afford a service to come pull it out and clear the room. All the local neighborhood men came and did it instead, and put the mattress out by her cans for garbage service for pickup. WM drivers said it was a biohazard and wouldn't touch it. It stank. So the men got together again after it sat visible on the corner for all to see for a week, loaded onto a pickup, and drove it to the dump themselves. Dad threw out the clothes he wore both times handling the mattress, said he wasn't interested in even trying to get the smell out. I would do the same. I think I'll pass on the mattress shopping for a while too. Story 7. This isn't even everything that went down with that neighbor, just some, not so brief highlights. So my mom had this neighbor who pretended to be weak from cancer and chemo so her landlord couldn't get mad at her for when trash bins were full and the lawn was filthy. She even went as far as shaving her head and faking a limp cane and everything. Mom baked her some cookies and offered to take care of her bins and lawn, and the neighbor spills about her scam. My mom, now enlightened about my neighbors, the fault in our stars BS, and tired of the trash blowing into our yard, called the landlord. Neighbor wasn't happy and would blast music at ungodly hours of the night and the wee morning to get back on my mom. Mom would get frustrated because she worked late and left early and filed a noise complaint with the police. Police arrived. The neighbor claims my mom, old little Asian lady, hurt her. Neighbor wants her arrested. Mom shows cops our security cam footage. No mom hurting. Instead, finds a crazy neighbor hurting her daughter out in the middle of the night. She's banging on her door. My mom comes out to check on noise, tries to bring a hysterical girl inside. It's like 2 a.m. And a neighbor comes out and sprays her with the hose. Neighbor taken away. Daughter sent to live with dad. Story 8. So my partner and I caught a disease in 2020. We're in the UK during the second wave. And this was mainly due to my partner working in a care home and I'm an engineer working on machinery and production facilities, etc. We didn't tell anyone, but we isolated ourselves and did the right thing. Our neighbors, friends at the time, found out about 2 weeks later. We were out of isolation and all clear. They flipped their mind and it never flipped back. I got squared up to by a 6'6" Viking of a man, making threats and telling me how I should have divulged my medical status to everyone in the apartment block because we, quote, put everyone at risk. Not to mention that this idiot also said that if he ever went outside at that time, we should wash the door handles and stuff, not that he should wash his own hands. Anyway, things got heated for the next few days, and whenever we see them now, they call us expletives, slam doors, and knock the mud off their shoes on our doorstep. We installed a camera to keep check over our 2 cars, and they told the management company, still there, just looking through a window, and they now complain we spy on them using it. I installed dash cams as a business, and my vehicles have them fitted. Weird if they didn't, right? And they say I'm spying on them with those too. They decided to keep moving the communal bench around and into the bushes, which my partner and I paid for out of our own pocket. So I just got mad and said, screw it, to myself and installed some ground anchors so the bench was bolted into the ground. This He-Man decides to rip the bench apart because he can't move it any longer. I confront him about it. Another nicer neighbor saw him do this and also saw him watering the ground to try and loosen the anchors, with the hosepipe I paid for also. And he slams the door in my face and threatens me once again. They constantly smoke and bake with it, so much so that the smells come into our own apartment. They're just generally horrible people now. They never explained why they turned on us. I don't particularly care for them anymore. I'm civil and I'll always be the bigger person. Just super weird how people can flip in an instant over something that never concerned them in the first place. It got to a point where police reports were filed and I was able to prosecute, but I asked the police not to because I don't want to be that kind of guy. I wish I had now, though. They both make life difficult for us at every opportunity. Story 9. A bit depressing, but a guy a couple of doors down when I was a kid ended himself. He was an introverted guy, didn't have many friends, didn't have a partner or family. He had a job that he'd go to, and I think he'd go to a pub occasionally and drink alone. He lived alone. I guess one day he decided he'd had enough and ended himself from a bedroom door upstairs. Even more depressingly, the very nature of his life meant nobody knew. He lay there for 6 weeks, unnoticed, in the middle of an unseasonably warm summer here in the north of England. We live by the sea, and farms aren't too far away, so the smell we put down to muck spreading on the farms, etc. We'd never smelled that before. It should have been obvious to us neighbors after a while. His yard was overgrown with grass. There were possibly hundreds of flies, some very large on all visible windows. Mail had piled up at the bottom of the door, which we could see through the glass. As kids, we thought it was haunted and abandoned because we never noticed the guy. We would often peek through the letterbox for a dare. The TV was on and static, finished breakfast and papers were still on the table and flew everywhere. Eventually, someone did become suspicious enough to call the police. As an adult, I feel pretty guilty about it, sorry for the guy immensely. I was young at the time, so didn't really know the signs, but the way the houses are around here, terraced housing either side of the road, I'd have thought it would have at least taken less time. Story 10. My neighbor, Karen. She was away for a while, and during that time, my dad saw a very skinny kitten on the fence between our houses. The cat eagerly went up to him, and we took the little cat in. The poor kitty's meow was raspy as if it had been dehydrated for God knows how long when I first saw it, and you could feel its ribs super easy. For 3 weeks, that cat lived with us. We had to buy all the supplies as we own a dog. We didn't think it had an owner, but during that time, we tried posting ads around town, seeing if we could find its owner. No claims. Suddenly, one day, my brother gets an angry text from our neighbor, accusing him of slandering her name, which he never spoke a word about her, and accusing us of stealing her cat, that she had someone come over to check on it. During that time, not one person came in or out of their house, and that if we don't give it back, she'll call the cops. She called the cops anyway, and the cops called our house. We explained the situation, and the cops seemed to have thought the neighbor was overreacting. The day after the cops called us, she showed up at our door first thing, pounding at the door and demanding we give her cat back. My mom just gave it back and we never saw that cat again. She did not thank us for taking care of the cat for so long. She was just a complete psycho throughout the entire thing. And I firmly believe she wasn't the owner, as no pet owner would treat the people who took care of their missing animal for so long like that, and that she was only acting in such a manner because she believed my brother was spreading lies about her. And if by a small chance she was the owner, she should have been charged with animal negligence because that poor thing was in such an awful condition when we first saw it. Yeah, right? Talk about ungrateful. She should have thanked him for saving her cat's life. Story 11. My neighbor is a 70-year-old misogynist. In March 2020, my dog slipped out of the house a few times. We eventually put up baby gates, but it took a few days to figure out new routines. Anyway, he got all angry with me during the first few days of Houdini making the great escape. He was so out of control, he came to my front door, veins popping in his forehead, and shouted for 3 to 4 minutes about how I will keep my dog on a leash, or else. And you don't want to find out what, or else is. I continued to nod while he ranted. Eventually, he shouted at me that his wife told him not to come over there. I finally broke my silence to tell him she is a smart woman and he should have listened to his wife. That was enough to get him to stomp away in anger, muttering under his breath, "I have 2 witnesses." So then we fast forward to about a week later. My dog is on a leash, tethered to a tree. She has enough slack to wander into the easement driveway about halfway way into the dirt road. Mr. Charming next door was driving out of his end of the road driveway towards us. I was kneeling, painting the shed with a brush when I realized he was entering the roadway. My dog was about 30 feet from me when I realized he was coming. He was in his medium blue Toyota Highlander about 100 feet from us. Had a normal person been driving, they would have idled briefly to allow me to put down the paintbrush and get my fat old dog out of the road. Instead, this schmuck rode his Toyota and headed straight for us. I didn't have time to pull her out of the road, and I stepped in front of his vehicle between me and the dog. His vehicle lurched to a stop while I deployed a prominent middle finger. He lost his mind. The next 10 minutes were spent with him threatening me when I put a garden shovel into the ground and invited him to cross the fence line. After a few minutes, I determined he was actually a coward. I felt safe enough to turn my back and walk inside to call the police. I filed a police report. About 15 minutes later, he returned to my yard to threaten me and lying to the police, and then he made a finger-pointy weapon at me and pulled the trigger. He smugly drove back to his driveway while I called the sheriff's deputy right back to file an addendum to my police report. There were about 2 more days of insanity, including his wife calling my house to ask why he was shouting and ranting. My mom answered and told his wife that I called the police, and if he returns to our property, he'll be trespassed and arrested. His lawyer's son was also returned home to the parents. He kept trying to blackmail, accuse me of brandishing a weapon, open carry on private property, and eventually begged me to not talk to the sheriff when they came to take a report. I spent the next few weeks working the property, long neglected repairs, etc. Every day, I openly carried a different weapon on my belt. I still flip the bird to their kitchen window every time I arrive or leave. Screw you, Chris. You're a terrible person, and I feel sorry for your wife and kids having to put up with you for 50 years. Story 12. We had these people that lived a couple houses down the street, and they always had really shady-looking people coming around at all hours of the day and the night. We all had a feeling they were dealers, and, well, we just minded our own business. One day, the house next to them sold, and a nice family with young children moved in. All was well for a couple months. Then the dealer house had a whole lot of liquid just seeping out of the garage, and it made a huge puddle in the gutter. So big that the new neighbor's kids decided to go and splash and play in it. They got extremely sick. A couple days later, the dealer house got raided. Turns out they had an ice slab or something in the garage, and that the water the kids were playing in had a lot of leaked residue in it. It was a huge bust, and like the entire family living there was in on it, even the teenage kids. I don't know what happened to them, but the kids made a full recovery and the family moved the next year. Story 13. So when I was a kid, I lived in this real terrible neighborhood in Riverside. Represent, LOL. We had 3 dogs, and unlike the rest of the neighborhood, our dogs were well trained and behaved, down to the point where there was a specific part of the backyard for them to do their business in, so we could pick it up easier. We lived there for 3 years and always got upset when our Pitty would make a mess in the wrong corner of the house behind the back house. Poor thing, we'd scold her and try to correct her, and it never worked. Literally, the day we moved out, my pops went to the back to make a final inspection, and what did he see? The little neighbor boys from next door scurrying over the fence, leaving behind a couple fresh mess. My dad is a patient man, but obviously he was like, what the heck? So he went next door before we left, informed the boys' grandma what they'd been doing the whole time, and proceeded to exit the house as she geared up to whip those boys out of their stupid. If you're enjoying the video so far, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 14. There was a creepy dude who lived next door to my condo, not attached, just next door. He used to prowl the neighborhood with a tall can of Bud Light. He was a self-appointed neighborhood watch, and he would hand out handwritten HOA infractions and try to start fights. He knew all the police. I think he used to be a dispatcher or something. Anyways, the cops never did anything except shake his hand when he called and asked him to cool it down. Anyway, he had a treadmill in his garage, and he'd yell at ESPN in his garage with his treadmill and tall boy, sometimes with the door open, sometimes closed. Well, it started something smelling awful in there, and yeah, you guessed it, he'd passed away. I'd called for a welfare check, but since he knew all the cops, they didn't come the first time I called, or the second. It took 7 days before they figured they should come out. It was a horror show. Don't know what got him, but I'll never forget that smell. The next neighbor who moved in got bees building hives in her walls, and then when she finally got them removed, suffered an aneurysm and passed away too. She was really nice. That condo may have been cursed. Again, the smell. I called that one too. They came right away for that one though. Story 15. Oh boy, I got you a story. This happened right in front of all of us. I, fortunately, was inside the house, and we learned the details later by the same neighbor. I live in a third world country to start, and my neighborhood isn't quite safe, so many people live in houses made in other backyards. The uphill neighbor didn't have nor care for a proper bathroom. She would just go somewhere. But the wastes ended up always at the downhill neighbors' backyards. She complained to her, but she said that it wasn't her problem and to get stuffed. While the neighbor, without complaining, left, she gathered the biggest bucket she could find and, I kid you not, started to fill it with the mess that got to her house. She waited like a week until it was filled to the brim, the willpower of that woman, and went uphill to the neighbor. Vecina abra! Open neighbor, she yelled, strong enough that everyone thought they had visitors, so all got to their windows. The old woman appears and bam, she lifted the bucket and threw all of its contents on her. She started screeching like a banshee while yelling, "Which I'm calling the cops. Frickin' call them. I'm just giving you back your mess and I will keep throwing your mess until you fix your mess." All in the raunchiest Spanish you could hear. It was her response and just returned to her house. The cops were called and the downhill protagonist had records and videos from before everything happened. Apparently, the old neighbor was so unhinged that they had her fighting, screaming at them for nothing, and even threatening them. So the lady didn't have a stand. She fixed her bath in like 2 days. Now she doesn't badmouth anyone. We all know why she got bathed. Story 16. During the first year of the infections, when the recs in my area were basically just don't gather indoors and wear masks if you absolutely had to go somewhere, during a peak that effectively meant everyone not actively passing away was being turned away from hospitals and told to try and wait it out at home because of how badly overwhelmed all local facilities were. One of my neighbors had a Christmas party with easily 30 plus people crammed into their tiny apartment. No masks on anyone visible at any point, and medicines weren't readily available except to the most high priority people at the time. This wasn't even the crazy part, even if it was super irresponsible. The crazy part was when one guy, obviously smashed out of his mind, stumbled outside, followed by another dude, and they got into a shouting match about whether or not it was okay for him to drive himself home, which is what originally drew my attention around 1 a.m. This escalated over the next 10 or so minutes into 3 to 5 people repeatedly grabbing Mr. Drinks by the arms and clothes to drag him back inside, only for him to come darting back out a moment later to clumsily sprint to his vehicle, but lack the hand-eye coordination to unlock it, all the while belligerently yelling about how if he wanted to risk crashing on his way home, that's my goddamn right. Someone started screaming, "Jesus Christ, just take his keys," over and over. Suddenly, it was a fight. Then it was 5 separate fights as pairs and clusters of people engaged, the whole party spilling outside to either gawk or rumble. Grown folks rolling around in the wet and slushy snow, pulling each other's jackets off, swinging, incoherently screaming, bystanders sporadically trying to pull people apart. A lot of ineffectual shouting to "Stop, stop." I was so exasperated but started crying laughing when I spotted this chick with long, skinny legs and tights, wearing a big, furry, short jacket, standing off to the side, calmly eating off a full paper plate and watching like this wasn't anything strange. The host finally came outside and started bellowing for everyone to leave because he'd just been told another neighbor had called the cops, and I watched as people, including the original hammered, scrambled to split into their vehicles and flee ASAP. Lots of swerving and honking as people all tried to be first out of the tiny shared parking area, and 2 collided at angles hard enough that I could hear the crumple and destruction of their respective bumpers and headlights across the way and through a closed window. All these people were white folks in their mid to late 40s. It was all a real classy affair. Story 17. I was out back splitting firewood while a few played on the trampoline. We have an electric fence acre of property behind our house. A neighbor comes out of the back door of his house and starts firing a weapon at a can he threw on the ground. I notice that it's pointing directly toward my home and kids. I yell for the kids to go inside and start waving to get his attention. He stops firing to reload and waves back. I walk over and say, "Hi, XXXX. You know, you can't really fire weapons out here because though we live in the country, we are still in a neighborhood. We only have 1 acre lots between us and somebody could get hurt. Also, the direction you're firing is directly through our yard toward my home and children playing outside." He said, "Well, I'm sorry you feel that way. I can fire any way I want as long as I'm safe." Then he looked at me weird and said, "You need to leave before I end you. Do you think you can come over here uninvited and tell me, a man with a weapon, what to do? I'm a man. You better go. You better run." I backed off of his property onto the neighbor's yard and started walking back toward my home. About 15 yards from my land, he starts firing again. I turn my head and sure enough, he's firing at me. He fired 6 shots and I heard 1 fly by. I ran the rest of the way, jumped my fence, and called the sheriff. Sheriff came out and a detective. Our security cameras caught me running, but the distance was too great for details. Luckily, since it was my word versus his, he was honest, dumb enough to admit firing at me to end me from coming over and talking to him about his rights. They arrested him and charged him. They said it was a slam dunk and he would get 10 years because he has a record. He was out on $300 bail a few hours later, hate calling my cell. The sheriff said due to the circumstance and their already backed up case, his first court date would be in 2 to 3 years, and it would drag on for at least 5 before he's locked up. They took his weapon, though. We are in the process of selling our home now and are going to travel full time and explore for a year or two while we grow our businesses. It's been almost 2 years and nothing else has happened. Story 18. My aunt used to babysit my older sister and I over the summers since both my parents worked and she was a stay-at-home mom. My aunt had 3 kids of her own, and in total there were 5 of us, all ranging from ages 7 to 12. Naturally, we spent all of our time playing outside with the neighbors' kids in an empty lot on our block. We'd play soccer, baseball, and light bottle rockets, normal kid stuff. Occasionally, the next door neighbor's kid would invite us over to his house to play his N64, so we'd also hang out there too. He had an older brother, 19, who would occasionally bring us snacks and rent us movies to watch when we were over. Overall, cool dude. One day, my dad was dropping us off at my aunt's, but the entire street was blocked off by police vehicles and, I kid you not, FBI trucks. We had to park blocks away and walk it to my aunt's, and when we got there, we realized that they were targeting the neighbor's house. We later found out that the older brother had gotten raided. Not a cool dude. To say we were shocked was an understatement. He never came out to play after that, and they moved shortly thereafter. Story 19. It's a tie, I guess. House across the way, a guy had a heart attack. His wife called 911. Police came flying in, and there were a bunch of them. But the ambulance drove past the turns into the neighborhood and drove back and forth for 10 minutes trying to figure out how to get to us until one of the officers went and escorted them in. Basically, to get into the neighborhood, you take a main road, and then there are 4 ways into the neighborhood, newer development at the time. 2 ways in on the north side and 2 ways on the west side, so the main road is basically an L shape. And we could see the ambulance drive past the ways in, turn onto the other part of the L, and drive past those entryways, up and over the hill, then come back, past all the entries again and over to the restaurant, about a 1/4 or 1/8 of a mile from the neighborhood, and back and forth and back and forth. Fortunately, the guy was stable, so no one passed away, but seriously never considered that an ambulance driver wouldn't know how to get somewhere and miss it over and over again. Another story, wake up for work and house across the street had had a party the night before. Go out to my car, and as I step outside, I see they've somehow created a solid 3-foot wide walkway of cans that went from their front door down to the street across the street, into my yard, turned 90 degrees, and extended all the way to the corner of the street. So I had the joyous task of calling work to let them know I'm going to be late, and call the police to make sure the mess is cleaned up and also to disrupt their hungover sleep. Story 20. When I was a kid, my next door neighbor was this woman with 3 kids, a boy, a younger girl, and a toddler girl. Well, 4 kids, but the oldest boy's in social care. And I'm pretty sure she was a user and also a street worker. She would go out and leave the kids with a babysitter, then not come home. More than a few times, my nan would go over there and let the babysitter go home and stay with the kids until the mom got back. That's all pretty messed up already, but it was nothing new to us. My sister and I lived with our nan because our mom was basically the same. She just let our nan take us on full time to keep us safe and out of care. The real messed up thing one day was in the summer, this random girl was in our neighborhood, and the neighborhood boy was just in the street with a big plank of wood and had smashed some eggs on it. We were all in a group just talking, I think, and he came over and he was pretending to touch people with the egg on the plant. He wasn't going to. He was annoying sometimes, but he wasn't malicious. But then he misjudged how close he got to this random girl and got literally the tiniest amount of egg on her denim skirt. She was not happy and she ran off. Later on, after everyone had gone home, we hear shouting coming from outside the house next door. My nan ran out, and this grown man was shouting at the boy, who was literally like 10, saying he harmed his daughter. Me and other kids in the neighborhood were also out there saying, no, he didn't hit her, and it wasn't a baseball bat, but he wouldn't listen. I feel at this point, it's also important to point out that this man, what a white middle-class man, and the boy was black and very obviously poor. His garden and house were a estate, and this man was saying awful stuff too. He went to grab the kid by the shirt, and my nan got between them and was obviously like, what the hell is wrong with you? He's a child. The boy, angry, ran in the house and grabbed a plastic bag, then started filling it with eggs and other gross stuff from the cupboard. He was going to throw it at this man. Then the man made his way into the house, also about time I pointed out that he was there alone. His mom had gone out and taken both the younger girls and just left him. My nan followed them in, got between them, and the guy was about to start on my nan when my uncle and some other older neighborhood boys ran in and basically scared him off. Police were called, nothing came of it, obviously. Then the next day, the guy came back and brought his wife and called my nan, a 60-something-year-old woman at the time, out to fight his wife. But then the mom of the boy was home by this point and she was up for it. She was a big woman, looked like she could handle herself. Suddenly, the wife didn't feel so up to getting in a fight. Scared them off by telling the police had been called. Not long after that, the family moved away for, I'm pretty sure, unrelated reasons. So, yeah, that was pretty messed up. Bonus, those schmucks had a son my age, and when I went to secondary school, he was in my year, but I had no idea for literally after I left school that he was related to that situation. And he turned out to be a massive schmuck too. Turns out he had been mistreating his long-term girlfriend. And when I brought all this up to my husband, who was also at the same school in the same year as us, he told me a story about how one time he went to their house, and his parents were really weird, like they were trying too hard to be part of the gang. And a big group of boys went upstairs together to watch videos. And my husband was so uncomfortable, he stayed downstairs and played console games with one other boy who didn't want to watch or whatever. And also, one of my best friends was at a house party that the son was hosting, and she said his dad was really creepy and was being inappropriate with most of the girls, and that his parents would always stick around when their kids threw parties. So creepy, gross family. Story 21. Used to live next door to a middle-aged lady. Very nice, always smiling, loved to do sports. Basically, every time I saw her, she was either cycling or running. Just a very active and pleasant person altogether. Now, my bedroom was right next to hers with a wall, obviously between our apartments. Then, suddenly one night, she starts screaming off at like 2 a.m., scares the hell out of me. And this goes on for like a month with some silent nights in between. Eventually, the screaming completely stops, and I find out from my third neighbor, who was mutual friends with the other neighbors' family, that she was sent to a mental hospital. A few months later, I finally ran into her after like a year, and she looks like a completely different person, and not a good way. Like a husk of her former self. This was the last time I ever saw her. About a half a year later, I'm making lunch and hear loud banging from her front door. I look through the peephole and see two people in full hazmat suits trying to break into her apartment. About 30 minutes later, they carry out a large black bag. Turns out no one could contact her for at least 10 days, so her mother called the police to try and find anything out. They broke in and found her passed away in her bedroom. The third neighbor later told me she was apparently disowned and cut off by her family for whatever reason, with only her mother trying to mend their relationship. We never found out how or why she passed away. I didn't see it in person, but just knowing I basically slept next to it for a week or so makes me feel a bit uneasy. A very bad situation all around. Story 22. The people across the street were a strange family with estranged kids. They tried very hard to be upper class in an upper middle class neighborhood. They had ivory luxury cars, a lot of marble accents. The eldest kid was a daughter, almost an adult when I moved in. The youngest was a son, about 14 or 15. When the son realized I worked in computers, he really tried to impress me by his R/master hacker vibe. But he knew the words, not the way to use them, claimed he hacked the Pentagon, he was rich in Dubai because he stole some sheik's account and stuff like that. The daughter was very headstrong and she had to be. Her father was downright cruel and we'd hear a lot of yelling from that house. The police were aware of the address, but no one got arrested, as far as I know. One day, her daughter, who must have been in her early 20s when this happened, said she was moving out and never coming back. Her father and her had quite the shouting match on the front lawn. Then she got in the car to drive away, but the father stood behind the car to prevent her from backing out, saying she had to end him first. The daughter kept inching backwards until the father simply would not back out any further. Then, without warning, she rode the car into forward, spun sharply to one side, drifted across the front lawn in a spin-out. She tore up a huge chunk of the lawn off the curb and down the street. I never saw her again. I'm not sure if she was aware she was going to do that or figured it out when her dad stood his ground, but it looked like she had tricked him beforehand. Chunks of sod shattered and flew through some of the front windows, and the lawn had to be professionally repaired. They sold the house right afterwards and moved out. A few years later, some investigators asked my wife if they had noticed a man who had lived there, apparently the uncle or brother of the owner. He, not the owner, was wanted for questioning, but by then it was years since they had moved out. We have another house where 3 unfortunate events have occurred with 3 unrelated, unconnected families who all passed away the same way. ending it all with a weapon in their backyard. Kind of Amityville-ish. The second one happened in 2003, which is where I heard from the neighbors that this is the second guy who has ended himself in the backyard. The first one was in 1986, almost parallel situations. Then in 2015, a completely different family, same thing. Story 23. During my early to mid-teen years, we were good with our neighbor behind us. Their girls played with my sisters. I played video games on a daily basis with their boys. It was all good. Well, we live in a busy area with a heavily used back road, and so we would allow the neighbor kids to use our gate and cross our property to avoid the busy road so they could go cross the street to some friends they had. One day, our gate didn't open. The uncle of the family came to our fence and tried to force the gate open. He couldn't get it open, so he decided to nail boards to our fence to block off the gate. My mom goes outside and asks what he's doing. He yells at her about how we lock the gate and won't let his kids see their friends across the street. Mom is confused by this because the lock on the gate has been broken for years. The only reason the gate didn't open that day was because one of the bricks on the ground got dislodged and held the gate closed. Easy fix. While dude is angry and in his frustrations, he threatens to literally end my sisters and if any of us ever set foot on his property. My mom thinks that's pretty rash but decides not to argue against it. Basically, she thought that's too bad because now our fence is boarded up, which means his kids have to use the busy road to go all the way around the neighborhood to get to the other house. Screw that guy. My friends, the neighbor boy's dad was super cool though. They invited me over for fireworks on the next 4th of July, and the whole time I could see the uncle scowling at me, but whatever. Well, if you like these stories so far, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video, and thanks for hanging with me on this one.